Hello, and welcome to the Archives. I'm Jen, your host, and today we're beginning with a creature that everybody knows, or at least everyone thinks they knows. This is the dragon paradox. Why do dragons exist in so many cultures? Let's pull this thread together. So when I say the word dragon, something probably appears in your mind immediately. Maybe it's Mushu from Mulan, a little tiny red fast-talking Eddie Murphy dragon, really sassy, not burdened by humility whatsoever. Perhaps it's Toothless from How to Train Your Dragon, somewhere between ancient mythical beast and extremely destructive house cat. Perhaps it's even Smaug from the Hobbit movies, curled possessively around a mountain of stolen gold. Or my absolute favorite, Drogon from Game of Thrones. Enormous, terrifying, generally capable of ending any political disagreement very abruptly. Maybe you picture the Red Dragon of Wales, the national flag, or even Shenron from Dragon Ball if you're an anime enthusiast or a 90s baby. The strange thing is that every one of those creatures is instantly recognizable as a dragon, and yet they barely resemble one another. Some have 4 legs, some have 2, some have wings, some don't. Some fly perfectly well without wings, which honestly kind of feels slightly unfair, maybe even a bit of cheating, A few breathe fire, but not all. Others command rivers, rain, or storms. A few guard treasure and protect kingdoms. Some are wise, sacred, or life-giving. Others seem to exist largely so that a hero can eventually kill them. So what actually makes a dragon a dragon? Now, before we go any further, we should probably deal with one of fantasy's most passionately defended arguments. So in modern fantasy, a Western dragon typically has 4 legs and a separate pair of wings. A wyvern generally has 2 legs with its wings functioning as its front limbs. So Drogon in Game of Thrones is technically built like a wyvern. This may come as upsetting news to some people, but here's the catch. That distinction isn't nearly as ancient or as universal as the internet sometimes makes it sound. It became especially useful in European heraldry before being adopted much more rigidly by modern fantasy, gaming, and film. So medieval storytellers weren't working from an officially approved dragon anatomy manual. The categories were typically messy, the language shifted, the artwork changed, and different cultures described completely different creatures that English speakers eventually gathered beneath one convenient label, dragon. And wyverns are only a branch of a much larger family tree. So, in essence, all wyverns are dragons, but not all dragons are wyverns. There are Amphipteres, winged serpents with no legs, lindworms, serpent-like dragons that might have 2 legs or none, old Germanic worms, where the word could simply mean snake, serpent, monster, or dragon, depending on the story. Even sea serpents often overlapped with dragon traditions, without everyone agreeing they belong in exactly the same category. Then we arrive in China, the lóng, usually long-bodied, typically wingless, often serpentine, yet unlike many dragons that later dominate European stories, the lóng is not primarily a force of evil. Traditionally, it is associated with rainfall, fertility, good fortune, and rivers. Also imperial authority, and also the balance of nature itself. Dragon kings governed bodies of water and brought the rains on which entire communities depended. Elsewhere, serpent beings could also be protectors. In Buddhist tradition, the Naga king, Makulinda, shelters the Buddha beneath his hood during a storm. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent, I apologize for butchering the name of this, Quetzalcoatl, was associated with wind, knowledge, creation, and sacred authority. So dragons were never one thing. Some were monsters, others gods, some guarded treasure, others guarded wisdom. Some represented chaos, others maintained order, and that may be the first real clue. Dragons are not remarkable because every culture imagined exactly the same creature, because they didn't. They're remarkable because cultures imagined creatures that could look different, behave differently, mean completely opposite things, and yet somehow, when we encounter them, we still recognize them a powerful serpent, a master of natural forces, guardians of boundaries, something connected to the parts of the world human beings could never completely understand or control. Which brings us to the real question at the heart of this episode. Why does humanity keep imagining dragons? Not just why ancient people imagine them, why do we keep doing it? Why, after thousands of years, are dragons still appearing in our books, in our films, in our games, and our stories? To begin answering that, we have to travel back long before Smaug and Drogon and Toothless. We have to go back before familiar fire-breathing dragons had even taken shape, back to some of the earliest dragon-like creatures humanity ever carved or worshipped, and eventually wrote about. So, if dragons weren't all imagined the same way, where do they actually begin? The honest answer is that they don't. There isn't one birthplace. The evidence points to something far more interesting. Dragon-like beings appear again and again in different places for different reasons, often separated by vast distances and long stretches of time. One of the oldest pieces of evidence doesn't come from a story at all. It comes from archaeology. In northeastern China, the Hongshan culture was carving beautiful jade objects roughly 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. Among them are small curved serpent-like carvings that archaeologists now call jade dragons. Some are even nicknamed pig dragons because of their round pig-like heads. Here's the important part though. We don't actually know what the people who carved them called them. Dragon is our label, not theirs. That distinction matters because archaeology can tell us what people made, but it can't always tell us what they believed. Still, those carvings show that long, serpentine, dragon-like imagery existed astonishingly early. And one of the richest early traditions come from Mesopotamia. Here we meet beings like Tiamat, the great chaos creature defeated by Marduk during the Babylonian creature story. Today, she's often described as a dragon, but that isn't quite how the earliest texts present her. She's better understood as a primordial force of chaos, something vast, ancient, and deeply connected to the sea. Another Mesopotamian creature, the Mushu, feels much closer to what we'd immediately recognize as a dragon. A long-scaled composite creature associated with the god Marduk, not merely a monster, but a sacred symbol. You can still see it decorating Babylon's famous Ishtar Gate. That alone changes one of our biggest assumptions. Not every dragon was something to kill. Some were protectors, others represented divine authority, and were symbols of legitimate power. As we move across the ancient world, another pattern begins to emerge. We find stories about a powerful serpent or dragon confronting a god or hero. The Hittites told of Illuyanka. In India, Indra battles Vrutra, releasing the world's waters. Egypt gives us Apep, the greatest serpent opposing the sun god Ra. In Greece, there are Python, Hydra, and Ladon. Different cultures, different religions, different languages, yet strangely similar stories. That doesn't necessarily mean they all copied one another, but it does suggest human beings kept returning to remarkably similar ideas. Even the word dragon tells part of that story. Our English word comes from the Greek drakon, by way of the Latin draco. Originally, drakon didn't mean the familiar winged, fire-breathing creature from modern fantasy. It usually referred to a great serpent or a powerful snake-like guardian. The dragon we picture today evolved much later. Meanwhile, China was following a very different path. Chinese dragons weren't primarily creatures of destruction. They became associated with rivers, rain, fertility, good harvests, and eventually imperial authority. Over thousands of years, they developed into symbols of prosperity and cosmic balance. It's one of the longest continuous dragon traditions anywhere in the world. But even that continuity isn't perfectly straight. The dragon changed. It evolved. Just like every other tradition we've looked at, And that's perhaps the most important lesson from the evidence. The earliest dragons don't all look alike. They don't all behave alike. Some are sacred, others terrifying. Some protect, their counterpart destroys. Some rule skies, others belong to the rivers and the sea. There isn't one original dragon hiding behind them all. There are many beings, and yet they keep circling the same ideas: power, water, chaos, and protection. So perhaps we've been asking the wrong question. Maybe the mystery isn't where did dragons come from? Maybe it's this: why did so many different cultures keep creating them in the first place? Because once you stop looking for a single origin, you start looking for something much deeper. Not where dragons began, but why human beings kept needing them. So if dragons didn't begin in one place, why do they keep appearing? How did people separated by oceans, languages, time keep imagining creatures that feel strangely the same? In fact, the strongest explanation is that there are, in fact, several. Think of dragons less as a single invention and more like a recipe. Different cultures had access to many of the same ingredients: snakes, storms, dangerous predators, strange bones, powerful rulers, floods, fire, and the deep human habit of turning the unknown into stories. They simply mixed those ingredients in different proportions. One of the oldest ideas is surprisingly simple: snakes. Humans are exceptionally good at noticing them. Some psychologists argue that our brains evolved to detect snake-like shapes unusually quickly because snakes posed a genuine threat throughout much of human evolution. That doesn't mean we're born terrified of snakes, but it may mean we're unusually good at noticing them. So if that's true, then it's not difficult to imagine those familiar serpents slowly growing larger, older, wiser, more dangerous, until they became dragons. But snakes can't explain everything. Chinese rain dragons don't really fit that picture. Neither do feathered serpents or dragons that protect kingdoms instead of threatening them. Long before anyone understood dinosaurs, ancient people occasionally uncovered enormous bones buried in hillsides and deserts. And obviously this was long before paleontology. So what else would you conclude? In China, fossils were even collected and traded as dragon bones, sometimes ground into traditional medicines. Elsewhere, strange skeletons may have inspired stories of giants, griffins, and dragons. So can fossils explain every dragon? Probably not. Can they explain some? Quite possibly. Weather may have mattered just as much. Across many ancient cultures, dragons became tangled up with rivers, storms, drought, lightning, or the sea. Sometimes they block the waters. Sometimes they control the rain. Other times they are the storm itself. So perhaps dragons weren't originally animals at all. Maybe they were humanity's way of giving nature a face, a way of saying, something powerful lives inside this storm. Some societies probably invented dragon-like beings completely independently. After all, people everywhere have encountered snakes, danger, floods, lightning, and the unsettling experience of finding something they couldn't explain. Sometimes different people arrive at similar ideas because they're solving similar problems, like different inventors creating umbrellas because they all got caught in the rain. There's another possibility too. Human beings are natural pattern makers. We tend to connect the dots. We can definitely exaggerate stories, and we notice unusual things. One strange sighting becomes a rumor. The rumor becomes a legend. The legend grows another head, another pair of wings, and another generation of storytellers. So, perhaps dragons evolved not biologically, but culturally, each generation adding something a little bit new. There's also a more psychological interpretation. Carl Jung argued that certain symbolic images appear repeatedly because they reflect deep patterns within the human mind. From that perspective, the dragon isn't a real animal at all. It's a symbol. Chaos, power, transformation, maybe the monster standing between who we are and who we might yet become? It's a fascinating idea, really, but it's important to remember that it's an interpretation, not historical proof. And that's true of almost every theory we've explored. Snake psychology explains some dragons, fossils explain others, weather explains many, and trade explains certain similarities. Psychology will explain why they still resonate, but none of those theories is sufficient on its own, but together they begin to make sense. Perhaps dragons survived because they were never solving just one problem. They explained nature, embodied power, guarded sacred places, warned against greed, represented kings, challenged heroes. It gave shape to fears that were otherwise invisible to us. So if dragons began as ways of explaining the world, like things we couldn't sort of explain ourselves, things we didn't understand, why didn't they disappear once we did, in fact, start understanding the world? We don't blame dragons for storms. We understand fossils now. We know what crocodiles are. We know what snakes are. We can explain what an eclipse is. We know that volcanoes aren't the gods roaring up from the center of the earth. Lightning isn't Zeus throwing his lightning bolts, and we understand disease. So why didn't dragons become obsolete? Because dragons were never just explanations, perhaps. They were symbols, and symbols don't die when science advances. They simply find new work. Instead of explaining nature, dragons began explaining us. They became our mirrors for ambition, for our greed, our courage, power, fear, freedom, loss, and most importantly, hope. And that's why they survived, I think. Science replaced some of their oldest jobs, but it could never replace what they meant, what they represented to us. You can see that change throughout history. In medieval Europe, dragons became symbols of evil, temptation, and chaos. Stories like St. George and the Dragon transformed older monster tales into morale lessons. The dragon became something to overcome, a test of virtue, a visible shape for invisible evil. Elsewhere, though, the story went in almost the opposite direction entirely. Again, with the Chinese dragons, they remained symbols of prosperity, rain, wisdom, and good fortune. Not monsters to destroy, but powers worthy of respect. The same creature by name, but entirely different meanings. And perhaps that's the dragon's greatest strength. By the 20th century, dragons changed again. Writers like J.R.R. Tolkien inherited thousands of years of myth and reshaped it for modern fantasy. Smaug wasn't simply a beast, he was intelligent, proud, manipulative, almost charismatic. Tolkien didn't invent dragons, but he helped define what many people now imagine when they hear the word. Since then, dragons have continued evolving. Modern dragons aren't always monsters. Sometimes they're companions, teachers, family, best friends. Sometimes they're more humane than the humans around them. That's the biggest change of all. For most of history, heroes proved themselves by killing dragons. And yet today, some of our favorite stories ask something completely different. What if the dragon was never the enemy? What if the real challenge is learning to understand it? That shift says something interesting about us. Modern stories are often less interested in defeating monsters and more interested in asking why the monster exists in the first place. Maybe that's because we've realized something. The things we fear most aren't always meant to be destroyed. Sometimes they're meant to be understood. And maybe dragons have always reflected that truth. They've carried whatever each generation needed them to carry, whether it was storms or kings, empires, greed, faith, magic, identity, like all of these many facets of the human experience. And yet dragons never stayed the same because we never stayed the same. And I think perhaps that's why they appear almost everywhere. Not because humanity inherited one original dragon, but because every generation kept rebuilding one until eventually the dragon became one of the most adaptable ideas we've ever created. Maybe that's the real answer to the question we started with. Why do so many cultures have dragons? Maybe they don't all share the same dragon. Perhaps they share the same instinct. The instinct to take the biggest mysteries, the greatest dangers, the deepest hopes, and give them a shape, something tangible, a shape we could tell stories about, a shape we could paint or carve, something that we could fear or fight, something wonderful that we could befriend and eventually become fascinated by. Maybe dragons were never just creatures. Maybe they were always conversations between humanity and everything we couldn't quite explain. Thank you for spending this time with me inside the archive. If you've enjoyed today's episode, I'd be genuinely grateful if you'd consider following the podcast and leaving a review. It really does help more people discover it. So until next time, stay curious, because every answer has a history and every mystery leaves an archive behind.